So first of all, thanks for the kind introduction and for inviting me to give this talk. So since I do not primarily work with a history of philosophy approach for my dissertation project, much of what I will say comes from a starting point in contemporary debates. And before I actually get to the dialogue promised and announced in the title, I want to offer some reflections on the theme of this lecture series and the relation of metaphysics, social ontology, and feminist phenomenology. This will provide the stage for my dialogue between Gerda Walther and Iris Young in the second and main part of my talk. I think that Young's phenomenologically inspired work in political theory can provide helpful nudges to read Walther's dissertation from a different angle than what readings that have mainly considered its usefulness for the contemporary debate on phenomenological social ontology have explored. The third part is then really just a short conclusion and outlook. So Gerda Walther's dissertation toward an ontology of social communities has recently received quite some renewed attention in phenomenological scholarship. This happened in the wake of a more general program to rediscover early phenomenological writings in sociality. This rediscover of the we revolves around a central question. What is it to belong to a we or an us? How is it that we can have experiences in the first person plural? How are such we experiences more than a mere aggregate of your experiences and my experiences? The contemporary inquirers have extensively engaged with analytic accounts of collective intentionality by authors such as Husserl, Gilbert, Bradman, or Tourmela. Phenomenologists have highlighted that a phenomenological approach comes with the advantage of looking beyond collective intentionality as a structure of joint action by investigating how we come to experience actual felt togetherness. Walther's dissertation is interesting for these inquiries because her notion of inner unification seems an interesting proposal to think about the effective nature of actually felt we experiences. Hence, most contemporary readings take inner unification to be the main useful result of Walther's analysis. These attempts to mine Walther's text for results that match the analytic categories of the contemporary debate come with the rather unfortunate side effect and tendency that for some reason, Walther ends up sandwiched between great and coincidentally male thinkers. This might partly be because her approach does not neatly map onto the metaphysical paradigms debated in the early days of the phenomenological movement. Walther did not endorse Husserl's transcendental turn, so that from this angle, it is certainly right to categorize her approach as metaphysically committed to a version of realistic eidetic phenomenology, just like Pfänder, Scheele, Stein, or Reinach. However, the first methodological section of her dissertation also shows that she was an avid reader of Husserl's work, which has led Schmidt and Wu to suspect that her account of re-experiences does come with, on their account, problematic egoic Husserlian tendencies. Others have highlighted that she interestingly also takes up some early traces of a Heideggerian existential approach. To briefly illustrate my concern and what I mean by the sandwiching tendencies, take the chapter Re-experiences with Walther by Schmidt and Wu. First of all, please note that my presentation might be a bit uncharitable by analytic standards, and I do by no means want to imply that what I call results-focused work is irrelevant. But this paper in particular also provides some very important historical contextualizations. But then again, throughout the paper, Schmidt and Wu do not hide that they construe Walther's account in such a way that it makes Hans Bernhard Schmidt's own notion of pre-reflective plural self-awareness appear to its best advantage. They praise Walther's contribution as sticking out in scope and detail, and note that while it fails to give an account of actual we-experience that lives up to Schmidt's criteria for effective co-experiencing, it, quote, does so in an instructive way. On this account of we-experience, we find Walther sandwiched somewhere between Scheele and Heidegger. And I think this is just illustrated nicely by this passage from the paper. Here, Heidegger steals the right idea from Scheele, and Walther's dissertation is left with the task of providing an interesting example for Heidegger's use. The right idea here is the claim that Schmidt attributes to Scheele. Experiences of genuine sharing are already pre-reflectively experienced as ours, and should thus not require any reference to reciprocal intentional attitudes in their description. Any account that presents the experiences as emerging as some higher order unity from other-oriented interpersonal engagement does, on Schmidt's account, fail to fully explain how the experience sharing experiences as generally ours rather than as yours or mine. This is to him metaphysically suspect because it requires reference to a somewhat magically emerging structure. At the end of the paper, Schmidt and Wu gesture towards Dan Zahavi's work as a contemporary example. Zahavi has conversely accused Hans Bernhard Schmidt of proposing a metaphysically suspect account of the experience. On his view, reflective plural self-awareness implies a problematic fusion account of shared experiencing that does not adequately reflect the status of subjectivity and the fundamental role of other-oriented forms of social cognition, such as empathy and second-person engagement. With respect to this contemporary quarrel about what makes a social ontological structure either fundamental or metaphysically suspect, Walther's dissertation is for Schmidt and Wu an instructive example for an account that almost gets it right, but remains partially committed to some unnecessary egoic Husserlian assumptions. The main justification of Schmidt and Wu for this is that Walther's analysis of inner unification does involve a description in terms of intentionality in the phenomenological sense. Interestingly, though, they concede that Walther's account might very well contain the sense of an experience that is generally shared as ours they are interested in. However, they conclude that there are simply too many other things going on and, quote, lumped together in Walther's analysis to make this aspect stand out enough. Now, by contrast, and in the same volume, Sebastian Luft outlines an approach to read Walther's dissertation as a project that may fall outside the traditional dividing lines in early phenomenology. He makes the interesting observation that the topic of Walther's dissertation, social communities, is actually a methodological challenge for any phenomenological approach. The deep metaphysical questions that we engage with when we reflect on the givenness of cups and tables, or more abstractly, on the givenness of sensations and values in themselves, are less relevant for this type of inquiry. Instead, the challenge is to think about how and if a phenomenological account that wants to maintain some form of correlative description of the relation between lived experience and subjectivity on the one hand, and the reality of the intentional object on the other hand, can really get community and social structure into view. How can such an inquiry be carried out? Does it ultimately require a perspective from outside, that is, on the community as an external structure, or is it possible to give it description from within? Luft thinks that such an investigation blurs the line between phenomenology of intersubjectivity and social ontology, where these two terms are often understood to coincide exactly with the just outlined methodological dividing lines within phenomenology. And just to quote Luft on this, although some may seem significant differences between both terms, phenomenology of intersubjectivity, perhaps committed to transcendental phenomenology, social ontology, perhaps erring on the side of realism, I take them to be more synonymous here. As will become clear in the further discussion of this paper, any designation as transcendental or realistic is inessential for the phenomenon under discussion here. The success of this analysis is thus independent of Stein's and Walther's rejection of Husserl's transcendental turn. I think Luft is basically right here. A phenomenological investigation into the experiences and meaning of social communities in social collectivization raises some unique methodological challenges. In my analysis in the second part, I want to draw on Luft's discussion of the self-referential nature of community from the same paper. However, in a first instance, Luft's careful approach might make us think that Walther's inquiry is simply so applied that metaphysical questions are just not really relevant, full stop. I think it is a bit too easy to dismiss the relevance of metaphysical lines of questioning by simply focusing on the concrete social ontological phenomena she discusses. So next, I'm going to suggest that there is a more subtle relevance, a more subtle way to reflect on the relevance of metaphysical questions in her work. This involves taking work on feminist phenomenology seriously. The debate about feminist phenomenology and its unique metaphysical and philosophical challenges have unfortunately not been recognized much in the contemporary rediscovery of the phenomenology of sociality. I think it can provide us with some useful reflections to set the scene for an alternative approach to read Walther's dissertation. This will provide the stage for my dialogue between her and Iris Marion Young. Now, how is feminist phenomenology concerned with metaphysical questions? In feminist theory, metaphysical questions usually pertain to the status of sexual difference. These are important debates, and women phenomenologists have certainly contributed to them. However, it is not the most useful angle to approach the relation of feminist phenomenology and metaphysics. Where the metaphysical status of sexual difference is concerned, notable contributors to feminist phenomenology, such as Edith Stein and Simone de Beauvoir, can only be read to offer opposite and contradictory approaches. Stein, through her engagement with the Catholic doctrine, where man and woman are supposed to complement each other in a higher order unity, defends a form of gender essentialism, whereas Beauvoir's one is not born a woman, but rather becomes a woman, is generally read to establish a version of the contemporarily more popular non-essentializing accounts of gender. On this issue, Walther would probably side with Stein. To my knowledge, Walther herself has not explicitly written about the question on women. The only passage in her dissertation I could find is this short section, and here she gestures towards the higher order unity between man and woman in a more careful way than Stein, in square brackets. For my argument, it does not matter whether Walther can contribute anything new to the question on women. I want to draw attention to a more subtle point about feminist phenomenology that brings out a minimal methodological consensus about how a phenomenological approach can address the reality of women. Interestingly, despite their different real and political and ethical conviction, one of the first steps for both Stein and Beauvoir is to highlight what a strange problem the question on woman is. As Sarah Hahnemann has put it, quote, "The question on woman is not a well-defined problem. It has different meanings, and even its sense and relevance can be doubted." Consider these parallel quotes from the introduction of Stein's Problems of Women's Education and Beauvoir's The Second Sex. Stein writes, "The matter of women's education was heavily disputed in the early days of the women's rights movement, but had seemed to have reached a more steady development. Today, however, it is again a hotly debated issue. It seems therefore obvious to approach the problem from the present-day situation of the woman. Already here, a difficulty arises. Can we even speak about the situation of the women?" And a bit less than 20 years later, Beauvoir writes, "I hesitated a long time before writing a book on women. The subject is irritating, especially for women, and it is not new. Enough ink has flowed over the quarrel about feminism. It is now almost over. Let's not talk about it anymore. Yet it is still being talked about. And the volumes of idiocies churned out over the past century do not seem to have clarified the problem. Besides, is there a problem, and what is it? Are there even women?" The metaphysically challenging phenomena that both Stein and Beauvoir single out here simply is the reality and situation of women. Their aim is to analyze the meanings, styles, and typifications involved, rather than to give a clear definition, to make claims about women's biological nature, or to provide an account of the socialization process that has led to the reality of women. The task is not to prove or disprove this reality, but to investigate the structures of meaning that enable its existence. And consider again Stein first. If one talks about the situation of the women, one does in any case not mean the species, but everything that might fall under such a general species. And this is such a great manifoldness of types and individuals that we can hardly speak of a common situation. And Beauvoir? If the female function is not enough to define woman, and if we also reject the explanation of the eternal feminine, but if we accept even temporarily that there are women on this earth, we then have to ask, what is a woman? Merely stating the problem suggests an immediate answer to me. It is significant that I pose it. It would never occur to a man to write a book on the singular situation of males in humanity. If I want to define myself, I first have to say I am a woman. All other assertions will arise from this basic truth. A man never begins by positing himself as an individual of a certain sex. That he is a man is obvious. Now, one powerful phenomenological tool to grasp this strange reality that women find themselves in is to describe it in terms of lived embodied experiences. Here, Sarah Hahnemann has shown how Beauvoir's and Stein's approaches to feminist phenomenology are compatible with a Husserlian and Merleau-Pontian transcendental idealist approach of meaning from descriptions in terms of the lived body. The Merleau-Pontian approach to describe lived embodied experience is also very popular with the very recently emerged project of critical phenomenology. Here, the strange and historically contingent reality that women and other oppressed and marginalized subjects find themselves in is generally approached as a structure of experience that comes with a so-called quasi-transcendental status, which gestures towards Foucault's and Derrida's engagements with the transcendental question. I think my proposal to bring Iris Marion Young and Gerda Walther in dialogue points towards a possible alternative approach to attend to the social and political realities and their contingent historical material conditions, in a way that takes lived experience at least just as seriously. The political and feminist theorist Iris Young certainly recognized the explanatory power of a description of gendered reality in terms of the lived body in her work. Best known among phenomenologists might be her 1980 landmark essay, Throwing Like a Girl. She gives a more systematic account of her approach in a later essay with the title Lived Body versus Gender. On the one hand, Young praises the advantage of a redescription of the various phenomena that fall under the rubric of gender. Quote, the diverse phenomena that have come under the rubric of gender in feminist theory can be redescribed in the idea of the lived body as some of many forms of bodily habitus and interactions with others that we enact and experience. According to Young, the phonological notion of the lived body provides the more flexible framework to account for our socially constituted experiences than the categories of natural sex and cultural gender. However, Young also argues that a redescription of gendered experiences in terms of the lived body is not enough. Rather than dispensing with the notion of gender entirely, she argues that it is still necessary to provide a complementary account of what groups us together. A more explicit account of experiences of being collectivized in a social structure is needed. I think such experiences are best described as threshold experiences of social connectedness. And they will be the pivot point for the dialogue I now want to stage between her and Walther. I argue that they seem interested in the same experientially hard-to-grasp threshold phenomena. And while they're interested in experientially hard-to-grasp phenomena, both nonetheless think that these can in fact be described while maintaining a point of view from within lived experiences of sociality. To further motivate this dialogue, I want to give two short vignettes that focus on their interests and engagement and political activism during their academic careers. Gerda Walther's wish to be a Marxist agitator is sometimes merely gestured towards as an anecdotal reference. Linda Lopez McAllister's biography on Walther attributes it much more intellectual relevance. When Walther arrived in Freiburg to join the Circle of Phenomenology in 1917, Husserl was, quote, not altogether overjoyed by the arrival of the spirited young Marxist who announced that her career goal was to become a political agitator. Husserl initially rejected her outright, but then sent her to Stein, who apparently was very amused by the situation and supported Walther's studies. Walther's political education in Marxism goes back to her early youth. Her family was left-wing and politically active, and Walther was educated by some of the leaders of the German socialist movement, who were all close family friends. She was an active member of the youth group for the Social Democratic Party. I think that her background in Marxism and early career interest in political activism is very relevant for her dissertation toward an ontology of social communities, because it becomes quite apparent from her examples that it's definitely not the only, but certainly one of her motivations for her investigation of social communities. To write this dissertation, she decided to return to Pfänder in Munich. Some say that is because she preferred Pfänder's realistic approach to phenomenology and disliked Husserl's transcendental turn. Lopez McAllister, however, gives Husserl's directive supervision approach that allowed students little freedom to develop their own ideas as the main reason. Walther knew she wanted to write about social communities and knew that Husserl had other ideas for her. Now, a small leap in time. For Iris Marion Young, her own experience of impoverishment due to being raised by a single mother in the America of the 50s shaped her lifelong investment in feminist and social welfare activism before she later became, quote, one of our era's most creative and influential political theorists. And here I quote her colleague at the University of Chicago, Martha Nussbaum, who writes this in the foreword to the posthumously published Responsibility for Justice. Throughout her academic career, Young remained politically active in what Linda Martine Alcoff characterizes as, quote, political struggles of the local and low-profile sort, the kind of issues without glories involving feminist issues, labor issues, and minority empowerment issues in every city and town she happened to be living in. even more saliently than for Walther's case, this background and political engagement is relevant for what Alcoff identifies as the metaphysical track of Young's work. Throughout her work, Young develops a, quote, social ontology of women's lives in both the public and private sphere. Young herself explains her approach to social ontology like this. My aim in theorizing with such a practical intent is not to develop systematic theories that can account for everything in a particular field of questioning, but rather to follow a line of reasoning in order to solve a conceptual or normative problem that arises from a practical context. The first essay in the volume, Gender as Seriality, theorizes, for example, social collectivity in general, but makes no claim to offer a complete social ontology. And here, I think, is where Young and Walther can be brought into conversation with one another. I think that many of the more result-focused readings of Walther often assume that her dissertation attempts to offer a complete social ontology because this aligns well with the project of her contemporaries Gurwitz, Scheele, and Husserl. The projects of Gurwitz and Scheele, respectively, aim to systematize and characterize all fundamental forms of human encounters and feelings of togetherness. However, providing such a full comprehensive system might not have been a priority for on Walther's agenda at all. In her dissertation, she seems genuinely fascinated by the methodological challenge to account for the first-person giveness of community, where community was not just a neutral research topic, but a highly politically relevant notion in 1920s Germany. My hunch is that Walther might, at least to some extent, also have been interested to theorize with a practical intent. And I want to take a closer look at the methodological challenges she identifies based on this idea. To do this, I will first highlight a more text-performative way to read Walther's analysis of the workers and present it as an alternative to the contemporary readings that identify inner unification as the main result of this passage and her dissertation. Then I will highlight why her discovery of the self-referential nature of communal experience fits very well with the alternative approach I outline. So among the early phenomenological analysis of intersubjectivity and sociality, Gerda Walther's dissertation stands out because it takes social communities as a phenomenon that can be investigated in its own right. Rather than to work her way up from the individual consciousness, Walther attempts to start her analysis from the socially situated individual. However, she does so while maintaining the methodological foundations of any phenomenological approach, namely that a phenomenological approach always is an account of the first-person givenness of experience and existence. She picks up the prominent distinctions between society, Gesellschaft, and community, Gemeinschaft, established by the leading sociologist of her time. Walther calls for a Copernican turn in sociology that does not merely think about the notions society and community as identifying two different external structures of sociality. Rather, she attempts to provide an analysis from within the community. This is supposed to describe the curious feature that communities can, so to speak, develop a life of their own, independent of their original members and its original purposes and goals. Members can perform acts in the name of the group. Communities can unite in higher order associations or federal systems. They can even continue to exist despite an initial unifying external purpose or motivation having expired. To do the plurality of real communities justice, Walther draws on an impressive array of vivid examples. They range from the fantasy play of kids that bond over an imagined fairy queen, the First World War nationalistic sentiments over Germany's victory as experienced by an elderly lady in the countryside and Emperor Wilhelm, political parties, the workers' movement, religious organization, communities of researchers, and so on. And now let's take a closer look at her analysis of the workers. Initially, Walther uses the example of, quote, a number of randomly collected workers, Slovak, Poles, Italians, and so on, who work at a construction site to observe that neither executing a coordinated activity, such as building a wall together and sharing living quarters, nor working under an externally exposed work order, Arbeitsordnung, that prescribes the rhythm of labor, time for breaks, and so on, makes them experience communal bonds. Yet, Walther concludes the presentation of the workers' case with the following reflection. But if now, instead of the inner strangeness and indifference, even hostility to all these other determinants, was added an inner connectedness of what sort whatsoever. It can be as loose as possible, have minimal extension, pertain only to the common life of the construction side, and have only the duration of the same. Do we then see a community before us? Here, and only here, it seems to us, do we have a true or real or actual community. Only through its inner connectedness, that feeling of belonging together, it can be as loose and limited as can be, a social formation turns into community. Now, typically, this is read as the final step in an analysis that searches for the missing element that turns social formations into communities. Following this reading, the result of Walther's analysis of the workers' case is a formula like this. Community equals social formation plus positive effective bonds of inner unification. A good historical example of such a reading of this passage can be found in Aaron Gowitz's habilitation, Human Encounters in the Social World. For an alternative approach to the same passage, I find a proposal by German studies scholar Niof Burns helpful. In her reading of the passage, she draws our attention to different terms that Walther uses to describe inner unification, like Zusammengehörigkeit, and points out that this irregularity has often been ignored in presentations of Walther's account in the contemporary rediscovery of phenomenological social ontology. For example, she picks up on an article by Zahevi and Salice that compares Stein, Walther, and Gurwitsch and observes that they state that Walther's main contribution to the field of social ontology lies in the emphasis on the feeling of belonging together that members of community, as opposed to a society, share. They treat this inner connection as the end result, as concept of Walther's philosophical deduction. Quote end. Instead, Burns proposes to recognize, quote, the performativity of Walther's textual and argumentative strategy. Her reading is informed by Walther's later work on mysticism and the general zeitgeist of the literature and poetry in 1920s Germany. Following this approach, we read the worker's example less for an analytic outcome, but more as an investigation that pushes the phenomenological method to its limits, because it investigates an experientially hard-to-grasp phenomenon. Rather than to take inner unification as a finalist result that henceforth defines communities, Walther might have been much more interested to push the structure to the limit. Although the case of the workers initially looks pretty hopeless, she does hope that there might be a window for feelings of belonging and solidarity. May they be as loose as possible. I think that following Burns' hint here to read Walther's dissertation as a more performative investigation that pushes the phenomenological method to its limits does not mean that we have to give up on Walther as a philosopher, and it should cast no doubts on Walther's analytic skills. And to make this case, I want to draw attention to a more analytically crafted proposal by Sebastian Luft from the paper that I cited at the beginning. Luft also feels that there is more to Walther's dissertation than the discovery of inner unification as a special form of we-experience. One of Walther's more interesting achievements might actually be her investigation into what he calls the self-referential nature of communities. After establishing the hard-to-grasp phenomenon of inner unification with the case of the workers, Walther dedicates a section to the common life on the basis of unification. From here onwards, she demonstrates her understanding for the plural forms of communal life. Rather than to merely think about communal experience as a romantic, positive, actual experience of unification, she describes unification as a complex structure. Not only can we have actual experiences of communalization, for example, the effective experience of togetherness and unification when we cheer for the victory of a football team, communal life and experiences can persist even if external reasons, purposes, and actual spatial opportunities for unifications have passed. This is where Walther introduces the idea of reflective and iterated communities. Both have in common that there is no longer an external object or objective that governs communal life, yet there is common meaning that permeates and regulates common life. Walther's example for reflective communities are intimate forms of communal experience in matrimony, friendship, and the family. In the case of these more intimate reflective communities, like a family, the community is end in itself, and it is on this basis that we deliberate and debate the good of the family. Luft points out that this does not mean that such deliberation is independent from the external world outside the particular community. He gives the decision whether to flee the country or not as a family under political persecution as an example. This becomes even more apparent in the case of what Walther calls iterated communities. Iterated communities are communities within a larger structural nexus or larger encompassing community. Examples are political parties, religious communities, or, quote, one could also count here a community for fostering of the German spirit and German morality within the German people, and so on. This community within the larger encompassing structure pursues the preservation, dominance, organization, and so on of the more encompassing nexus as end in itself. In Luft's reading, the more generic way to express this moment of communal experience at play in both reflective and iterated communities is self-referentiality. He suggests that this is not just a special feature of intimate communities like the family, but that all communities, in order to qualify for first personal givenness of communal experience, must have a minimal self-referential element. Although Walther does never make this strong point anywhere explicitly herself, he is convinced that this is a fair conclusion warranted by her account. Quote, while some communities may perhaps be mainly or even exclusively reflective, self-referential in nature, like a family, with the qualifiers that it too must consider external aspects, I suggest expanding Walther's intriguing analysis to apply to all communities. Such a self-reflection is, at least at times, necessary for a self-assessment or a self-assurance as to what the community is, what it stands for, what is best for it, how it can be preserved, how it can be moved forward in the future. Such a self-reflection is, in fact, necessary, especially in light of the external world, which is constantly changing. And he continues by posing an intriguing question. What is, for instance, the mission of a certain organization if the purpose which defined the mission 100 years ago has vanished? Say, an organization fighting women's right to vote. Luft mentions this example as an aside, and is himself more interested in expanding on Walther's discovery of the minimal self-referential element to develop more contemporary politically appropriate descriptions of experiences of the state and citizenship. I, however, think that this case in particular provides a really interesting avenue to develop the idea that communal experiences have a minimal self-referential element further. It is here that I want to introduce Young's idea to think about gender as a seriality and tentatively show how Walther's work might help us reflect on contemporary theoretical and practical problems in social movements and activism. I have already introduced Young's contributions to social ontology by highlighting that she is not interested in developing a comprehensive account of all possible forms of human sociality, but is motivated by problems from real-world social activism. In light of the concerns about intersectionality that dominated the discussions of feminist and social movements in the 1990s, Young somehow wants to maintain, quote, the possibility of thinking about women as some kind of group. Importantly for Young, this is not an exercise of pointing to an externally purely structural feature, but something that we can in fact experience. She starts the paper Gender as Seriality with an example from her own experience of activism. Campaigning for Black African-American Shirley Wright's election to the Worcester School Committee. Young remembers. A few weeks later, a friend and I distributed Shirley Wright's flyers outside a grocery store. The flyers displayed a photo of Shirley and basics about her qualifications and issues. In the course of the morning, at least 2 women, both white, exclaimed to me, "I'm so glad to see a woman run for a school committee." This African-American woman claimed to speak for women in Worcester, and some white women noticed and felt affinity with her as a woman. This seemed to me at the time an unremarkable, easily understandable affinity. Recent discussions among feminists about the difficulties and dangers of talking about women as a single group, however, make such incidents appear at least puzzling. The pressing dilemma for intersectional feminist theory in the 90s was, and to some still extent is today, that, quote, without some sense in which woman is the name of a social collective, there is nothing special about feminist politics. At the same time, quote, any efforts to identify the attributes of that collective appear to undermine feminist politics by leaving out some women whom feminists ought to include. Young's solution to the dilemma involves the idea that there is a difference between a group in the sense of a self-consciously, mutually acknowledging collective and the less organized and unself-conscious collective unity that activist groups in particular tend to arise from and fall back into again. She illustrates the difference by coming back to her initial example of her own activist experience. She argues that when Shirley Wright claims to represent all the people of Worcester, but emphasizes a particular need to have women's voices on the committee and to represent minorities, she is, quote, not claiming any group solidarity among the women of Worcester, either around her candidacy or in any other respect, but is referring to, gesturing toward, a serial structure that conditions her own position and that she aims to politicize. The speech itself does maybe invite and evoke to form an actual group or community of women on the basis of their seriality, but her candidacy speech neither names a group nor generates it. Quote end. However, when Young hands out flyers to the women and they respond effectively to seeing a woman run for school committee, this is the start of something that Young calls a proto-group. It might lead to the formation of an actual group and activist community, say a Women for Shirley Wright group. Young notes that, quote, in relation to the series of women, or even the series of the women of Worcester, this group is necessarily partial. It will probably attract only a certain kind of women with only some kind of experiences, and it will only focus on some issues. And it is here that Young grapples with a similar, or maybe even the same experientially hard to grasp threshold phenomenon that Walther's workers' examples revolved around, at least if we follow the performative read rather than the results-focused reading. A crucial difference in Young's and Walther's accounts is that they seem to arrive there from opposite ends. Young's paper is mainly focused on the thin experience of being collectivized in larger structural societal units. The corresponding experience is one of passivity and anonymity. It is a mere experience of facticity. Yet this minimal experience of being collectivized seems to open a window for some kind of, and here quote Walther again, inner connectedness of which sort whatsoever, may be as loose as possible. Walther, on the other hand, centers her analysis around an experience of community that is characteristic for the discourse in 1920s Germany. The war enthusiasm for World War I transformed into a fascination for charismatic leadership, genuine experiences of sharing, and effervescent feelings of togetherness. These sentiments were articulated in the youth movement of the time in the idea of the Bündische Erlebnis, convenant experience. Walther herself was in touch with the George-Kreis and answered a dissertation with an excerpt from Georges Stern des Bundes. Thus, while Walther acknowledges the possibility of looser forms of interconnectedness and describes the possibility of iterated community, inner unification and actual communities do also have the status of some sort of ideal. Here, Young is much more critical of the excluding tendencies of such strong experiences of community and puts much more emphasis on an ideal of sharing that first and foremost allows us to articulate differences and the relationality of our perspectives. Nonetheless, both Young and Walther agree that it does matter to conceptualize workers and women as collectivized. According to Young, this helps to maintain a point of view outside liberal individualism, where liberal individualism denies or at least undermines the reality of groups. This seems to be a motivation for both Young and Walther. To do this reality of groups justice, both think it is necessary to account for the impact of external material reality for experiences of community and collectivization. I think this is an aspect that my dialogue can highlight about Walther's work and Luft's proposal about the self-referential nature of community. Walther emphasizes the internal perspective of communal experience beyond external purposes and goals. But this does not mean that such internal references and reflections are not also inherently shaped by the real external material world in its historical contingency. Consider again the example of a family deliberating what is good for the family under threat of political persecution. For Young, accounting for experiences of the anonymity and contingency of materiality becomes even more important. The experience of being collectivized as woman, Black, or worker is not just an external structure, but enabled by how we are grouped with respect to complex and multidimensional material reality. The kinds of objects that constitute this materiality encompass not only physical objects and female bodies and in their biological processes, but more importantly, meanings, rules, and practices, such as institutionalized heterosexuality and sexual division of labor. These structures do not define or derive from individual, personal, or group identities. They are just experienced as material facts of social reality. Everyone who is grouped by them must somehow relate and respond to them. And just to illustrate more concretely what Young has in mind here, as an example, quote, in a heterosexist society, everyone must deal with an act in relation to structures of enforced heterosexuality. But there are many attitudes a particular individual can take towards that necessity. She can internalize norms of feminine masochism, she can try to avoid sexual interaction, she can affirmatively take up the sexual role for her own ends, she can reject heterosexual requirements and love other women, to name just a few. When gesturing towards this level of loose grouping, saying I am a woman appeals to an anonymous experience of this material reality as facticity. Quote, as I utter the phrase, I experience a serial interchangeability between myself and others. In the newspaper, I read about a woman who was raped, and I empathize with her because I recognize that in my serialized existence, I am rapeable, the potential object of male objectification. What Young's shift in focus to the experience of this anonymous, very loose experience of being grouped can add here is a further motivation to highlight how actual communities respond to the ever-changing external world and material reality by providing us with tools to describe what we are responding to and how we experience this external to the community material facticity in more detail. On Walther's accounts, such larger encompassing structures are just external structures of society without such a minimal experiential element. Now, to sum up my dialogue, and my dialogical intervention with Young and in the second part, let's reconsider the activist group of women's right to vote for women's right to vote, Luft mentions in passing. First of all, we can note that it is an iterated community within a larger encompassing structure that, unlike most group of women, takes changing something about the materiality that conditions women's experience as their explicit goal. In the case of the suffragettes, this was the right to vote. Furthermore, they are necessarily a partial grouping that does not represent all possible attitudes towards the larger encompassing grouping. In the case of the suffragettes, the activist groups consisted mainly of white upper-class women that often articulated racist sentiments. Luft asks, what happens with such an organization after its aim, voting rights for women, has been achieved and its original members have passed away? An internal experiential description of community allows for the possibility of such communities to persist in some way despite changing external circumstances. But it just as much allows for the possibilities of such communities to fade back into the serial anonymity of the larger encompassing structure. While in one description, we might say that the suffragette organizations have faded away, on a different description, we might say that all following waves of feminism refer to their initial attempts to politicize the anonymous grouping of women's experiences as facticity due to multifaceted material conditions. Feminist and other social activist movements simultaneously appear to be continuous and discontinuous in nature. Here we are back to the metaphysically challenging starting point that Stein and Beauvoir independently chose for their investigation into the curious question on women. Enough ink has flowed over the quarrel about feminism. It is now almost over. Let's not talk about it anymore. Yet it is still being talked about. Finally, I want to offer a brief outlook on different issues my analysis can gesture towards. I have tried to sketch an alternative approach to read Walther's dissertation. Rather than to follow the more result-focused reading that makes Walther's analysis fit into the contemporary debates on collective intentionality and shared emotions, I have suggested that she might actually also have been interested in an analytically, experientially, and phenomenologically much harder to grasp threshold phenomenon of social experience. I do not think that it is necessary for me to claim or show that this approach is somehow superior to more result-focused work. However, it can shift our attention toward a framework of experiential sharing that is more attentive to the, at the same time, fleeting and persistent nature of effectively and reflectively experienced social and communal bonds and the complex relationality of our perspectives and social positionings. By contrast, examples in contemporary social ontology often work in a framework where we theorize around coordination, cooperation, and co-influencing. A particular advantage of the alternative approach might be that it makes it much easier to thematize from today's perspective politically problematic tendencies without having to be dismissive or apologetic about them. Walther's overall focus on community is rather uncritical in her descriptions of strong effervescence feeling of unification. And it would be strange to deny this, even though she does not just naively endorse a romantic notion of community. We definitely should not just blindly follow the trajectory she outlines for her ethics of community, the section that ends with the reference to Georges' poem Stern des Bundes. With Young, I have suggested that we can articulate good reasons for why we would want to be a lot more careful about thinking about feelings of community and togetherness as normative ideals. Critically reflecting on how the political zeitgeist makes its way into Walther's and other early phenomenologists' work might also remind us and teach us that it is sometimes not so easy to maintain a critical attitude when we attempt to theorize, and in particular when we attempt to theorize with a practical intent today, despite the best intentions. Now, coming back to my initial reflections on the relation of metaphysics and feminist phenomenology, I wanted to show that feminist phenomenology is not just an applied topic, but must always somehow engage with metaphysical lines of questioning. This is easy to dismiss or ignore because this engagement is generally more subtle and somewhat orthogonal to the traditional and classically debated metaphysical paradigms in phenomenology. I have argued that feminist phenomenology overall tries to somehow tackle a description of the experientially hard to grasp reality of women. I think this type of problem should really be of interest to anyone who claims that they want to provide a comprehensive account of how we experience experiential sharing, human encounters, and feelings of togetherness in the social world. My concrete juxtaposition of Young's and Walther's approach to this type of problem might also be of interest for recent debates about critical phenomenology. I think somewhere in between their approaches might be an interesting alternative to thematize the complex impact of historically contingent material reality on our lived experience of community and sociality. And that is while maintaining a phenomenological perspective that takes lived embodied experience seriously.